Buried deep in the Colorado mountains lies a place so secure, so silent, that even the most dangerous men on Earth vanish inside it forever. No escapes. No second chances. Just concrete, steel, and a sentence carved into time. This is ADX Florence, the prison the world calls the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Before we step inside America's most feared prison, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on all notifications, and join our community exploring the darkest corners of crime, punishment, and hidden truth. Now, let's enter the place built for men too dangerous for any other prison. The road to ADX Florence begins long before you ever see the prison itself. Drivers who've made the trip say the landscape warns you first: vast empty fields, rocky plateaus, and an eerie silence that settles over the earth as if nature itself knows what lies ahead. There are no distractions out here. No large towns. No clusters of homes. Just the wind curling across Colorado's high desert, whispering over red dirt and broken stone. Then, rising almost unnaturally from the horizon, the complex appears. A concrete monolith flanked by motion sensors, guard towers, and layers upon layers of razor wire. ADX Florence does not try to look like a correctional facility. It looks like a final destination. Designed in the aftermath of rising gang violence, high-profile escapes, and assaults inside federal prisons, the structure was meant to do one thing only: contain men classified as uncontrollable. Not difficult. Not dangerous. Uncontrollable. The kind of inmates who could spark riots simply by stepping into general population. The kind whose names make every warden in America shift uncomfortably. Federal architects had a simple directive. Build a place where the most dangerous prisoners in the country could be locked away without ever touching the world again. And they delivered. The first shock many visitors experience comes at the perimeter. Cameras with 360-degree rotation. Seismic sensors buried underground. Ground microphones capable of detecting footsteps. The entire exterior is designed like a puzzle that can only be solved one way: in, never out. But the true power of ADX isn't in its perimeter, it's in its design philosophy. The prison is shaped like a fortress: inward-facing courtyards, metal blast doors, and window slits angled upward so prisoners cannot see the horizon. Even the hallways are built at sharp angles to prevent anyone from gaining a long line of sight. Everything in this structure exists for a purpose. Inside the administrative wing, the story of ADX's birth is preserved in files, schematics, and memos marked urgent and classified. Reports describe inmates who coordinated deadly assaults across different states. Others orchestrated crimes from inside a cell. One attempted escape by hiding inside a food cart. Another took control of an entire wing with nothing but a handmade weapon. These were men who turned maximum security prisons into battlegrounds. So, the government responded by creating something beyond maximum security, the Supermax. And as the blueprints grew darker and more complex, corrections officials realized they weren't just designing a prison. They were designing a system meant to break control, break influence, and if necessary, break the will of those who had refused to be broken anywhere else. By the time construction was completed in 1994, the message to the world was clear. Whoever you are, whatever you've done, your power ends here. And for the prisoners who would eventually be sent inside: terrorists, cartel leaders, mob bosses, espionage agents, and violent lifers, ADX wasn't simply another stop in the federal system. It was the end of the line. For the men who built the place, ADX was an engineering masterpiece. For the men who run it, it's a pressure cooker that must never, ever malfunction. For the men who live inside it, it's a world made of silence, concrete, and the cold realization that time moves differently when every day looks and feels exactly the same. But this chapter is just the foundation, the blueprint. To truly understand ADX Florence, we have to step deeper. Into the structure. Into the cells. Into the minds of those who have walked its corridors knowing they would never again touch freedom. And that journey begins now. The arrival process at ADX Florence is not like entering any other prison in America. There is no shouting, no chaos, no sound of inmates slamming fists on doors as a new prisoner walks in. ADX is silent, eerily silent. The silence itself feels like a warning, as if the walls are whispering, You don't belong here unless you're the worst of the worst. For incoming inmates, the journey usually begins in shackles. Not ordinary shackles, heavy, reinforced restraints attached at wrists, waist, and ankles. U.S. Marshals refer to their escort protocols as diamond tier transport, meaning the individual being moved ranks among the highest risk offenders in the system. Some have led gangs from behind bars. Others have murdered inside prison walls. A few have tried to escape multiple times. And a small number are infamous enough that their names are recognized around the world. From the moment the transport vehicle enters the outer checkpoint, it's clear nothing inside ADX is left to chance. Armed officers verify credentials, inspect every inch of the vehicle, and cross-check files. There are mirrored poles that allow officers to check underneath without crouching, and high-powered scanners that sweep for anomalies. No one enters without being scrutinized. As the gates roll open, the surroundings shift in tone. The architecture feels almost militaristic, sharp angles, sun-faded concrete, and a sterile emptiness that makes the prisoner feel isolated even before stepping inside. Guards who work here don't bark commands. They don't need to. Their authority is absolute, backed by a structure designed to eliminate conflict before it even begins. Inside the processing area, fluorescent lights hum overhead as officers carefully remove the restraints. Even that is done with precision. One officer handles the key. Another maintains distance with a protective shield. A third stands by with non-lethal force options. A fourth monitors cameras. Training here is intense, and every movement is practiced until it becomes instinct. After a thorough strip search and medical screening, the prisoner is handed a simple set of tan-colored clothing. No laces. No metal. No customization allowed. The fabric feels rough, almost symbolic, the kind of material that reminds the wearer daily that comfort is a privilege they no longer have. Next comes the moment most inmates never forget. The walk down the range. The range is a long, narrow hallway lined with cells where some of the most notorious inmates in America reside. But the new arrival does not see their faces. Heavy steel doors and small, reinforced windows keep everything obscured. Sometimes, though, the silence breaks. A scrape. A cough. A soft, echoing laugh from somewhere down the corridor. Subtle, but enough to send chills up the spine. Every step echoes against the concrete. Every breath feels heavy. Every second feels suspended in time. Correctional officers describe this walk as psychological conditioning. It doesn't matter how tough a prisoner thinks they are, ADX strips away bravado. The facility is designed to dominate the senses, to overwhelm, to remind inmates that they are stepping into a world where freedom is measured not in miles, but in inches. At the end of the range, the inmate reaches their new home, a 7 by 12-foot cell made almost entirely of poured concrete. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. The stool is concrete. Even the mirror, a polished steel plate, reflects a warped image rather than a clear one. There are no sharp edges. No loose fixtures. Nothing that can be manipulated, altered, or used for escape. The door closes with a sound that resonates through the hallway, a deep metallic boom that seems to vibrate in the chest. It's a sound described by former guards as the sound of finality. Some prisoners flinch the first time they hear it. Others stand still, stunned. A few, the ones who've lived rough lives inside the system, simply stare ahead, trying to swallow the truth settling into their bones. ADX is unlike anything else they've ever experienced. Inside the cell, the air feels still, almost untouched. A thin window, just 4 inches wide, sits high on the wall. It allows a slice of sky to appear, but nothing more. Designed to prevent orientation, it denies inmates the ability to understand where they are or what lies beyond the walls. You can't see mountains. You can't see fences. You can't see guards. Just a sliver of light, a reminder that the outside world exists, but not for you. Once the inmate is secured, the staff begin their routine. Documenting behavior. Recording responses. Assessing psychological stability. Everything is logged. Everything is monitored. Prisoners quickly learn the rules. Meals come through slots, showers happen 3 times a week, and recreation takes place in a concrete enclosure the size of a small room with a roof partially open to the sky. There is no yard. There are no communal activities. Human contact is reduced to short, controlled interactions through layers of steel and plexiglass. Some inmates handle the transition with cold, quiet acceptance. Others pace their cells, rage, or break down in tears. ADX has seen men known for violence collapse under the weight of isolation, and it's seen men who once shouted orders to hundreds reduced to whispering to themselves in the dark. Yet the process continues, the same way it has for decades. Silent. Precise. Unforgiving. Because this is the gauntlet. The threshold between a life of chaos and a future defined by concrete walls, locked doors, and the relentless passage of time. Inside ADX Florence, time loses its shape. Hours stretch, days blend, and weeks dissolve into a monotony so intense that former inmates have described it as living inside a slow-moving dream. But this dream is not soft or surreal. It is sharp. Harsh. Designed with intention. Inmates at ADX spend an average of 22 to 23 hours every single day inside their cells. Even the act of waking up feels scripted. There are no morning alarms. No voices echoing down hallways. No clatter of footsteps or prison chatter. Instead, prisoners wake to the same quiet that has wrapped itself around the facility since the moment they arrived. The cell is their universe. A narrow rectangle of cold concrete. The bed is a slab covered with a thin mattress. The desk and stool, both molded into the wall, offer no sense of comfort. The toilet sits in the corner, stainless steel and always visible. The sink dispenses warm water that never quite feels clean. And above it all, the window, just inches wide, lets in a ribbon of daylight that shifts across the floor but reveals nothing of the world outside. Meals arrive like clockwork. Breakfast around 6 a.m., lunch before noon, and dinner in late afternoon. Each tray comes through a steel slot in the door, a rectangular opening that becomes the inmate's only point of physical interaction with the outside. Officers slide the tray in without making eye contact. Sometimes they exchange a word or two, strictly procedural, but the exchange is brief. Efficient. Controlled. The food itself is standard federal fare: oatmeal, sandwiches, rice, beans, processed meat, fruit. On rare occasions, inmates receive something different, like a holiday meal, but even then the food is eaten alone, in silence. Some men devour their meals quickly. Others take small bites, stretching the act of eating as long as possible, just to make the day feel less empty. Recreation, the 1 hour of the day when prisoners leave their cells, takes place in what many have described as a concrete cage. Unlike other prisons, ADX has no open yards, no grass, no dirt. Instead, inmates step into an enclosure surrounded by tall walls and overhead mesh. The only view is the sky. On some days, clouds drift overhead. On others, the sun sits like a distant flame, reminding prisoners that freedom exists somewhere far beyond their reach. Most inmates pace during rec time. Back and forth. Back and forth. A repetitive rhythm that becomes both exercise and meditation. Some whisper to themselves. Others stay silent. A few stand still, eyes closed, soaking in the feeling of air that isn't filtered through ventilation systems. For many, this single hour is the only moment when they feel something resembling humanity. After rec, prisoners return to the cell, their world shrinking once again to the size of a bathroom. There are books, religious texts, legal materials, or limited library options that rotate monthly. There is a black and white television mounted behind protective casing, broadcasting approved educational programs, old movies, or news with long delays. But even the TV feels distant, as if the world on the screen belongs to another life. Communication with other inmates is minimal, but not impossible. Some men shout through vents or tap on walls using improvised codes. These messages travel slowly, muffled and distorted, becoming a lifeline in an environment that suppresses every form of connection. A single conversation, barely audible, can feel like a social event. But even with all these distractions, the isolation cuts deep. Prison psychologists call it sensorial deprivation. A slow, creeping form of mental erosion caused by lack of physical contact, emotional exchange, and environmental variation. At ADX, every day looks the same. Every sound is the same. The walls never change. The light never changes. The routine never changes. Some inmates adapt by turning inward, organizing their minds like soldiers organizing their gear. They count steps, repeat mantras, create imaginary worlds. Others carve patterns into their matrices or scratch marks onto concrete just to track the passing weeks. But not everyone adapts. Men have unraveled in these cells. Whispers become screams. Pacing becomes frantic. Silence becomes a weight too heavy to carry. Former officers tell stories of inmates who began talking to shadows on the wall, convinced someone else lived inside the concrete. Others refused to shower or leave their cells for recreation, terrified of stepping into a space that felt unfamiliar after years indoors. A few tried to hurt themselves, believing that pain was the only sensation powerful enough to remind them they were still alive. Yet for all the emotional toll, ADX functions with machine-like precision. Every movement is scheduled. Every interaction is documented. Every deviation is corrected. Even nighttime offers little relief. Doors lock. Lights dim. Cameras continue to monitor. Some prisoners sleep easily, exhausted by monotony. Others stare at the ceiling for hours, listening to the faint hum of ventilation, counting the seconds between each mechanical click, each shift of air pressure. The quiet becomes a companion, a cold, loyal presence that never leaves. And through it all, the prison maintains an atmosphere of controlled stillness. Guards stay behind thick glass. Movements are orchestrated so inmates rarely see another human being. Conversations with staff are brief and limited. Medical appointments take place behind layers of separation. Even religious services are conducted through closed-circuit screens. ADX Florence is not called the Alcatraz of the Rockies because it is impenetrable, it is called that because it is empty in a way that breaks more than bodies. It breaks patterns. It breaks time. It breaks identity. Life here is not about survival in the physical sense. It is about enduring a world where the walls never move, the hours never shift, and the only escape lies in the mind. To understand ADX Florence, you can't just look at the concrete, the razor wire, or the architecture engineered to suffocate freedom. You must look inward into the minds of the men held inside its walls. Because while every inch of the facility is designed to control the body, its true impact lies in how it reshapes the human psyche. Psychologists who have studied long-term solitary confinement describe a phenomenon called cell drift, where a prisoner's sense of identity begins to blur around the edges. Days blend, thoughts loop, the mind folds inward. Humans are social creatures by design, wired to interpret faces, voices, gestures. ADX strips that away completely. No faces. No contact. No voices except your own echoing off concrete. In this silence, the mind searches for stimulation. Sometimes it finds memories. Sometimes it finds focus. But for others, it finds shadows. One former prisoner, during a rare court testimony, described the first stages of isolation as a gradual softening of reality. He explained that in the beginning, he kept himself sharp, doing push-ups, reading, reciting stories he remembered from childhood. But after months alone, the routines began to feel pointless. His thoughts drifted like dust particles in a sunbeam, slow, directionless. He said, "You don't realize when you're slipping. You only realize after you've already slipped." Inside ADX, inmates often report heightened sensitivity to sound. A distant cough. The clank of a closing door. The hum of fluorescent lights. These small noises can feel magnified in the emptiness, as if the world is shrinking to the size of their own heartbeat. For men who once navigated violent, chaotic environments, the stillness becomes its own form of pressure, subtle, unyielding, relentless. Some inmates develop rituals to maintain their grip on reality. They count tiles on the ceiling. Memorize the cracks in the concrete. Calculate the angles of their window's shadow throughout the day. One man reportedly recited multiplication tables from 1 to 1,000 every morning, just to remind himself he still could. Another invented a fictional football league in his mind, tracking stats and scores for teams that never existed. The human brain does what it must to survive. But not all minds adapt. ADX staff are trained to identify signs of deteriorating mental health, though the line between discipline and breakdown is often blurred in such an environment. Some men begin pacing obsessively. Others stand motionless for hours. A few sleep excessively, escaping into dreams where freedom still exists. But the clearest sign of psychological strain is increased self-talk. Whispering. Muttering. Full conversations held with invisible companions. For some inmates, these imagined voices become a lifeline. For others, they become torment. Mental health professionals have long debated the ethics of long-term solitary confinement. Some argue it's necessary for control in facilities housing the most violent and unpredictable individuals. Others claim no human mind can withstand such extreme deprivation without suffering damage. Lawsuits have been filed. Reports published. But ADX remains what it was built to be, the final stop for men considered too dangerous, too influential, or too unmanageable for any other prison. Yet here's the paradox. Inside these concrete boxes, even the most hardened criminals can become vulnerable. Gang leaders who once commanded hundreds now spend weeks without speaking to another person. Terrorists who inspired waves of followers are reduced to silence. Cartel bosses, mob hitmen, violent offenders, they all face the same thing. 4 walls, 1 door, and a window so narrow that it denies them a view of the world they once controlled. And in this isolation, some experience regret for the first time. Others feel fear. A few embrace the solitude, claiming it gives them clarity they never had. But for many, the psychological toll becomes a battle they fight every hour. Officers at ADX, despite their strict training, often witness the toll firsthand. They see the blank stares, the sudden bursts of emotion, the quiet desperation in how some inmates hold on to routines as if those routines are the last threads keeping them together. One guard once explained, "This place doesn't have fights. It has breakdowns. A man can survive violence. He can fight back. But he can't fight silence. Still, the system continues ticking, cold and calculated. Medical teams make rounds, checking vital signs and logging notes. Some inmates see therapists through thick glass, speaking in monitored, time-limited sessions. Others refuse help, either out of pride or a belief that no one can understand what long-term isolation feels like. Because the truth is simple, ADX Florence wasn't designed for rehabilitation. It was designed for containment. And containment, by its nature, does not nurture the mind, it compresses it. Over months and years, the walls begin to press inward metaphorically, shaping thoughts, altering habits, shifting behavior. The environment becomes the inmate's world, and the world becomes the cell. A space so small that eventually, it feels as if the prisoner's mind is shrinking to match it. Yet even in this oppressive environment, resilience surfaces. Some men discover internal worlds they never knew existed, writing, drawing, meditating, studying legal documents. A handful even find renewed faith, claiming the silence gives them the one thing they never had on the outside: time. Time to think. Time to reflect. Time to reckon with who they are. But for others, time is the enemy. A force that cuts deeper than any blade. A reminder that each passing second is another fragment of themselves slipping into the void. This battle, the battle of the mind, is the true heart of ADX Florence. Because here, punishment is not delivered by guards, or rules, or cells. It is delivered by silence. By isolation. By the unchanging, unrelenting stillness that surrounds every man who enters. When people speak about ADX Florence, they rarely talk about the building first. They talk about the men inside it, names whispered with a mixture of fascination and unease. In many ways, the inmates themselves have become part of the prison's identity, like living shadows that haunt the quiet corridors. It's not just a facility. It's a roster of notoriety. ADX has housed terrorists, cartel bosses, gang commanders, espionage agents, assassins, and individuals whose crimes were so severe, the federal government needed a place where influence, violence, and communication could be contained as tightly as their bodies. Here, the world's most dangerous men live within a system designed to silence their power entirely. The range, specifically the H Unit, holds prisoners so infamous that their names alone conjure global headlines. But inside ADX, fame means nothing. Every inmate is reduced to the same routine, the same cell, the same silence. One inmate once described it this way: "It's the only place where everyone is a somebody, and yet everyone is a nobody." Among the most well-known was Ramzi Youssef, mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. A man whose plot shook the nation and whose ambitions went far beyond what he was able to achieve. Yet inside ADX, Youssef lived in near-complete darkness at times, lights controlled externally to prevent communication. His world shrank to the size of a concrete box. The mastermind, the planner, the orchestrator reduced to whispering to himself in the silence. Then there was Terry Nichols, co-conspirator in the Oklahoma City bombing. The man responsible for helping plan one of the deadliest domestic attacks in American history. At ADX, Nichols lived a life far removed from the chaos he helped unleash. No followers. No ideology. Just routines, meals, and endless hours of reflection. ADX has also held mafia figures like Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, a man whose brutality in the underworld became the stuff of legend. Casso ordered hits with casual ease, reportedly orchestrating dozens of murders. Yet the very violence that made him powerful on the streets was irrelevant inside ADX. Here, ambition meets immovable stone. Power meets isolation. The communicator becomes the isolated. The prison has also housed members of dangerous gangs, leaders whose words once sparked violence across multiple states. Inside ADX, their voices reach no one. Their networks vanish. Their empires dissolve. Even coded letters or smuggled messages are nearly impossible to send due to strict mail monitoring. For many gang leaders, ADX is the death of influence, even if their bodies continue living. And then there are the lone wolves, individuals who operated outside organized crime. Men like Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, whose acts of calculated violence terrorized America for nearly 2 decades. At ADX, Kaczynski became one of the quietest inmates. Some staff recall him spending long hours reading or writing. But he, too, was placed inside a world where intellectual brilliance could find no audience. In many prisons, notoriety creates hierarchy. In ADX, notoriety creates silence. Because the men here are not allowed to mix. They cannot share meals, stories, or allegiances. They cannot echo their philosophies or extend their influence. Even during recreation, they are alone. Some call it the place where reputations go to die. Others call it purgatory for men who shaped history in the darkest ways imaginable. Yet despite the separation, inmates sometimes learn who resides down the range. They recognize coughs, footsteps, or slight accents in shouted conversations through vents. A man might lie awake listening to someone pacing in another cell, realizing that the voice belongs to an individual whose crimes filled newspapers for years. There's a strange irony in that, how the walls that separate them still allow faint traces of presence to seep through. Staff at ADX talk about this phenomenon carefully. They are trained never to disclose identities, never to reveal who is where. But word travels, even in silence. The building itself becomes a repository of secrets. Doors marked only by numbers hide entire histories. Some guards have described the experience as walking through a museum where the exhibits stare back at you. But ADX doesn't see these men as icons or legends. It sees them as risks. Risks to security. Risks to themselves. Risks to the outside world. Many of the inmates at ADX were transferred there not because of the crimes that sent them to prison, but because of what they continued to do after incarceration. Organizing riots. Ordering killings. Manipulating networks. Escaping or attempting to. The facility isn't about punishment for past crimes. It's about prevention of future ones. And for some, the silence becomes the ultimate punishment. There are stories, quiet, rarely spoken stories of inmates who entered ADX defiant, unbroken, almost proud of their reputations. Men who once commanded fear with a single look. Men who had followers, soldiers, entire organizations behind them. But after months in isolation, guards say some of these same men become visibly smaller. less confident. Their past power unable to pierce the psychological walls of ADX. Because here, the ghosts of crimes past have no audience. Just echoes. Just memories. Just four walls that do not care who you were. Yet the true power of these inmates, the true stories behind their presence, extend far beyond their crimes. They reveal something deeper: how a society handles its most extreme individuals. Whether isolation can truly neutralize influence. Whether containment is enough to erase danger. And most of all, they reveal the one truth ADX forces every inmate to face. When everything you were is stripped away, what remains? The ghosts of the range carry the answer. In whispers, in pacing footsteps, in restless nights spent facing the unending silence. ADX Florence may look like a fortress built of concrete and razor wire, but its true strength lies in the systems you don't immediately see, the silent, always running engines of surveillance and control that turn the entire facility into a living machine. A machine built for one purpose: to eliminate unpredictability. Unlike ordinary prisons, where chaos can erupt from a single misstep, ADX is engineered to prevent even the possibility of conflict. Every corridor, every door, every movement is choreographed long before it happens. It's a place where spontaneity goes to die. The first layer of control is separation. No two high-risk inmates walk the same hallway at the same time. No one is moved without advance scheduling. No prisoner sees another's face unless the system allows it. Movements are coordinated down to the second. If an inmate must go to medical or a rare appointment, the entire section is cleared. Doors along the route are locked both ahead and behind, creating a path that isolates the prisoner from any contact. Guards stand ready, but their role is often secondary. The architecture does most of the work: narrow angles, long sightlines, blast-proof glass, heavy steel. At ADX, a single door always stands between a prisoner and freedom. But in most cases, it's more like 15. Every door requires electronic authorization. Every lock records a timestamp. Cameras cover nearly every inch of the facility. Even the yards, enclosed, concrete spaces, have surveillance systems pointed at them from multiple angles. There are no blind spots. Not even for a moment. Another layer of control is physical structure. Cells are designed to prevent escape, assault, or sabotage. Defacing a wall? Nearly impossible. Manipulating locks? Designs prevent it. Creating weapons? There's nothing in the cell that can be shaped into one. Even the bed frame is molded from concrete. ADX removes not just opportunity, but imagination. It forces the environment into stillness. And then there's communication control, the invisible wall separating inmates from the outside world. Every piece of mail is scanned. Every phone call, if allowed at all, is monitored and limited to approved family or attorneys. Conversations take place through reinforced barriers. Inmates cannot shout messages during movement because movements rarely overlap. Even messages in the walls, old prison tricks, fail here. Vent systems are isolated. Pipes do not connect cells in ways that allow communication. It is a social vacuum. But perhaps the most chilling layer of control is the psychological one built into everyday procedures. Guards never rush. Never raise their voices. Never engage in unnecessary conversation. This isn't apathy. It's strategy. Officers are trained to operate like moving pieces in a machine that values precision above all else. Emotional distance prevents manipulation. Professionalism prevents escalation. Their routines are as regulated as the inmates. Even the tone of their voices follows protocol. One former staff member described it like this: predictability is security. If an inmate knows exactly what will happen every second of the day, he can't use uncertainty to his advantage. Food delivery follows the same concept: scheduled, predictable, controlled. The slot in the door opens. The tray slides in. It closes. No dialogue. No hesitation. No chance for conflict. Medical checks also follow strict structure. Nurses walk the range with carts, dispensing medication through the same food slots, using long tools to maintain distance. If a prisoner needs more serious care, He is escorted by multiple officers, restrained, supervised through at least 3 layers of controlled portals. ADX does not rely on brute force. It relies on eliminating variables. Even the recreation cages are arranged to prevent visual contact, sometimes staggered, sometimes covered, sometimes separated by barriers. For inmates whose influence remains a concern, recreation times are altered daily, preventing predictable patterns that could be exploited. And yet, the system is not perfect. It requires constant vigilance. Officers monitor signs of agitation. Cameras track subtle changes in routine. Silence is not always a comfort, it can signal distress or brewing instability. Staff undergo training not just in physical intervention, but in psychological observation. A paused step. A change in sleep pattern. A refusal to eat. These tiny signals can hint at bigger problems. Because in a facility built to prevent violence, the greatest threat isn't always physical. It's psychological volatility. The kind that festers in isolation. ADX uses step-down programs to manage this, systems that allow inmates to earn small privileges through consistent good behavior. A radio. A slightly larger rec space. Limited contact with another inmate. These incremental changes offer relief, but they also function as a pressure valve. A controlled release to prevent the mind from cracking under relentless confinement. But it's a delicate balance. If an inmate becomes unpredictable, privileges disappear instantly. If he becomes too quiet, mental health teams step in. If he shows signs of manipulation, staff adjust his environment. Nothing at ADX is left to routine alone. The routine itself is constantly monitored. And perhaps the most defining feature of ADX security is this. Every system is built around the assumption that every inmate is capable of extraordinary danger. Not because they always are, but because the cost of assuming otherwise is too high. This mindset transforms the prison from a place of punishment into a machine of prevention. A place where walls think, corridors remember, and every second is recorded. Other prisons react to violence. ADX anticipates it before it happens. And in the quiet hum of endless surveillance, the inmates live inside a structure that watches more closely than any guard ever could. A structure that never sleeps, never blinks, never relaxes. A structure that knows everything. Except how it feels to be human inside it. For most people, silence is peaceful. For inmates inside ADX Florence, silence is a weapon. A tool. A slow-working psychological blade designed to carve compliance into even the most defiant minds. Every hallway, every pod, every steel door in this place is engineered to absorb sound, to make sure voices dissolve before they travel more than a few feet. Even footsteps fade unnaturally fast, swallowed by layers of concrete and security padding. What remains is a crushing quietness that sits on your chest like a weight, pressing harder each day. The inmates quickly learn that silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of isolation. When the walls stop talking back, when echoes don't respond, when your own breathing becomes the loudest thing in your world, that's when this place begins its real work. That's when the prison stops being a building and becomes something far more intimate, a second skin you can never remove. Guards walk the ranges with calculated steps, communicating mostly with hand signals. Even their radios are modified to prevent loud bursts of sound that could break the psychological balance of the environment. Everything is measured, controlled, intentional. Any disturbance, any unexpected noise, becomes immediately suspicious, because in a place where silence rules, noise is rebellion. Inmates in the control unit feel the silence first. It wraps around them from day one like a freezing fog. These are the prisoners who challenged the government, who ran criminal empires from inside other prisons, who orchestrated hits with nothing but a message passed through a vent. ADX ends all that. No voices through vents. No conversations through pipes. No tapping codes through walls. The architects made sure of that. Vents are sound baffled, pipes are sealed behind extra concrete, and the walls are thick enough to swallow screams. Some inmates refuse to accept the soundlessness. They yell, they bang on their doors, they try to make their presence known. But the walls don't answer, and the staff won't acknowledge them unless absolutely necessary. Eventually the noise stops. It always stops. One former guard once described ADX as a place where time has no sound. That's not poetic exaggeration. Inside these cells, there's no ticking clock, no television chatter, no voices from other inmates drifting from cell to cell. Even during showers, recreation, or medical visits, the quiet remains. Prisoners walk in tethered chains, overseen by multiple officers, but the only things they hear are the clinking metal restraints and their own heartbeat. Psychologists call it sensory deprivation. Prison officials call it security. But inmates call it something else, the fade. The point where a man stops feeling connected to the outside world. Where memories blur. Where the brain tries to fill the quiet spaces with hallucinations, whispers, or fragments of conversations that never happened. Some pace in circles for hours just to hear the faint sound of their shoes brushing the floor. Others hum just to remind themselves they still exist. The silence protocol isn't just part of the prison, it's the invisible guard that never leaves its post. It's the unseen warden. The unseen punishment. And for many inmates, it becomes the biggest battle they will ever face, not escaping the walls, but escaping the silence inside their own mind. Yet even in this enforced quiet, stories survive. Rumors drift in the smallest cracks, faint, nearly impossible to verify. A guard mentioning an inmate by mistake. A distant echo of a cell door far down the range. The occasional thud of a restraint chair being moved. Traces of a world beyond the cell that remind prisoners they're not alone, even if they never see another face. But the silence never truly breaks. It only shifts. Because in ADX Florence, even sound must follow the rules. In the end, ADX Florence remains more than a facility. More than a fortress. More than the sum of its steel doors and concrete cells. It is a symbol, one carved into the Rocky Mountains with a level of intention the world rarely witnesses. A creation born out of fear, necessity, and the relentless pursuit of control in a nation facing threats unlike anything it had seen before. But for every story told about this place, there are 100 more locked behind layers of secrecy. Lives that continue in slow motion, inside rooms built to erase movement. Voices that were silenced long before the doors closed behind them. Men who committed unthinkable crimes, and men who lost themselves long before they ever stepped inside. Whether you see ADX as justice or cruelty depends on where you stand. Some call it protection. Others call it punishment. And some, those who've walked its corridors or survived its silence, describe it as something far more complicated. A place that reveals what happens when a society chooses absolute security over every other human consideration. What's undeniable is this: the world outside keeps moving, while time inside ADX bends into something unrecognizable. For the inmates, days blend into months. Months blur into years. And the world they once knew becomes a memory fading behind soundproof walls. The prison doesn't just contain bodies, it suspends lives. And as long as threats exist, as long as the darkest corners of crime produce individuals the system believes cannot be housed anywhere else, ADX Florence will remain active, waiting, always ready for the next name destined to be swallowed by its silence. But perhaps the real question isn't what ADX does to the men inside. Perhaps the real question is what it reveals about all of us. Because the Alcatraz of the Rockies wasn't built in a vacuum. It was built by a society that decided some people should be shut away so completely that even their voices should not escape. A society willing to sacrifice light for safety, and silence for control. The prison stands today as a monument, one that forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most unbreakable walls are not the ones built to keep people in, but the ones built to keep the world out.